Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Lexie Smyth. I'm one of the campaign managers here at Barnes& Noble, and with me today is Jenna Seery, who is our publisher liaison. We are so thrilled to be in conversation with Clare Leslie Hall, the author of our March Book Club selection, Broken Country. If you sent in questions via the Eventbrite, Jenna and I have them. You can also submit questions via the Q&A module, which Jenna and I will be moderating. As a reminder, this is going to be a conversation with spoilers, so if you haven't finished the book, you can always come back later as this will be posted on the Barnes& Noble YouTube channel. All right, now that all of that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get into it. So, Claire, one of the first things that caught my attention while I was reading the book is the setting. This village, the estate of Meadowlands, the farmland. It feels like the setting is almost a character unto itself. Is the book inspired by a particular place? And can you tell us a bit about the importance of setting to this story?
Oh, yes. I'm so glad you felt like that because that's exactly what I hoped. I really wanted the setting to be a character in its own right. And it's actually my setting. It's Dorset, where I live in the southwest of England. And we live in an old farmhouse surrounded by farmland. And in the course of writing this book, I got to know quite a lot of farmers. I spent a lot of time farmers to research the characters. And it kind of brought the setting alive for me. And so it was very important to me to try and capture that. I actually went and stayed with a couple on a small holding, actually quite a long way away from here. But they really inspired Frank and Beth's farm for me because what they were so dedicated to their land and to their animals, and I just wanted that to come across. And also, Hempston, the village in the novel, is inspired by a village called Semley, which is where my son used to go to primary school when he was little. And I kind of think it's similar. It's a village that has very big houses and then a lot of kind of much more ordinary people. And I loved the idea of having a village that was very closed and had a lot of secrets, and everybody knows it's got a shop and a school, and everybody knows everybody else's business. So I kind of based it on this village, Hempston.
I love that. And I think that so much of that really draws you into the story and it just makes it so easy to sink in and to become part of what we're reading. And I think the other thing that really did that for me as I was going through is the way you've woven together sort of three timelines as you sort of learn bits and pieces of this story from different perspectives. Did you know when you started writing the book that it would be in these timelines, and how did you sort of plot out those details?
Yeah, I'm glad you did. Some people don't like a dual timeline. I love a dual timeline because I think it gives you the opportunity to show gradually, how the things from the past come back and haunt the future. I always knew that there would be two timelines. I knew there would be the 1955 timeline and the 1968 timeline. And what I wanted to capture with those two was, Beth is a woman who is torn between two men and two lifestyles. So she has this dichotomy. And I really wanted the reader, if possible, to sort of fall in love with Gabriel in 1955 and get swept up by that incredibly passionate first love affair. And then, hello, the next chapter, you're with Frank 13 years later in a really good marriage. So I always knew there was going to be that duality, and that was how I wanted it to be. But the third timeline, the courtroom drama, that actually came quite late on. In fact, I can remember it was about 2 years into the writing of it. And I always knew that a man died and that who the man was, and what we can say. And I remember saying to my husband, if I could include a murder trial, I think it would take the book in a really new direction. And so I went and spent a week watching a murder trial in the Old Bailey, which is a very famous courthouse. And it was incredibly inspiring, actually, just seeing the sort of theatre and the drama of the court. And then I came home and wrote my version of it. So that sort of third timeline came quite late on, and it took the book in a really new direction.
Lexi and I were talking earlier, and we think I'm sure there is a version of this story that was told chronologically, but there's something about that propulsion you naturally get when you're going back and forth, and then you're adding in, like you said, that third perspective where suddenly you are getting details that you don't know how they fit in yet. It really keeps you, I know for us, it just kept us being like, all right, well, what's going on the next page? And then you've read the whole book.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. And actually, there's a fourth timeline because there's also the end, isn't there?
That's
The Grace's book. Yes.
So, well, at the heart of this book, there is a love triangle between Beth, Frank, and Gabriel. I also wanted to talk about the parallel triangle to that, which is that of Frank, Jimmy, and Beth. I would love for you to talk a bit more about how you wrote this family and all of the connections between Frank, Jimmy, and Beth, because I found their triangle really interesting as well.
Oh, okay. Yes. I agree. It was so I basically the brothers was a really important relationship for me to get right. I think that I find Frank and Jimmy very interesting because they are men of the 1950s and they're closed down by grief because nobody ever helps them as children when they lose their mother or shows them how to grieve and how to process their emotions. And then suddenly Beth comes along and Beth, I know she makes some mistakes, but she's the most emotionally mature in some ways, I think, because she does face her difficult emotions. And she's very honest with how she's feeling. And she comes along and she's the first woman in their life and she sort of changes everything. And David, Frank and Jimmy's father, is, he's grief stricken by losing his wife so tragically, and he's quite closed down until Bobby is born. And so really they're this trio. And Jimmy, who I think loses his mother when he's 9 and sort of stops caring about himself. Um, but he really comes into his own when he delivers Bobby. And I think that at that point, he becomes godlike to Beth in that particular moment. And she always sees him and gives him respect. And I think he learns to respect himself from that moment. And I think that she knows that Frank has done everything in his power to try and keep Jimmy on track, but it's not really enough. And I think she knows how desperately Frank loves Jimmy, and she loves him too. And so it's this incredibly intense bond between the three of them. And so when Jimmy feels that, well, when Beth betrays Frank, it absolutely destroys him because the three of them are so closely connected that they almost sort of feel each other's pain as if it's their own, I would say.
I love that you bring up grief because that is something that was so prevalent to me as I was reading the way that grief just seeps into all of these characters' lives, and they are truly impacted, whether they understand it or not, by the different griefs that they're experiencing, whether it was for the brothers and their mother or the loss of Bobby, to watch the different ways that these characters respond, whether it's to turn outward or inward or somewhere between. I think that's really interesting. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about imbuing that feeling into the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the struggles, well, it wasn't so much a struggle, but one of the important things, because it's a very emotional book, and I am, as a writer, drawn to emotion. I can't really start a story unless I'm pulled by some strong emotion. And in Beth's case, the emotion was yearning. She was yearning not just for Gabriel, but she was yearning for her past before grief changed her into someone she didn't want to be. And I, I have 3 children. I'm happy to say I'm very lucky. They're all, very healthy. And I think as a mother, I didn't ever really think I would write a book about a mother losing a child. But Beth, the way the story arrived, I just saw this couple in the field, and I knew that Leo had reminded Beth of the son they'd lost. The story just came, and I was sort of almost powerless to do anything other than write it. And so I think I could imagine exactly who she was from the moment she came into my head. I knew who she was because I knew that she was dealing with this unimaginable loss. And I also knew that she was dealing with temptation. And I knew that the temptation was partly because of the loss, because she was trying to recapture who she was before. Um, and I understood the brother's grief. I didn't know it at the time, but I also lost a parent when I was young. And I think I knew, when I look back on it, I knew exactly how they didn't know how to grieve and they didn't know how to process it. And I think that I probably had a lot in common with Frank and Jimmy when I was 20 myself and going through a similar experience. And so I think I knew their pain. But as I say, there's some moments of real sadness in the book, and I think I worked hardest on trying to get plenty of light as well, to sort of balance the pain, because Beth in particular has an enormous amount thrown at her in the course of the novel.
She certainly does. Something that I also found really interesting is how we see these characters all kind of develop throughout these different timelines. And Gabriel was such an interesting character to me. Particularly, as a young person, he struggled to kind of deal with things in a proper way in the early timeline. Particularly, I'm thinking when he brings Beth to dinner with his parents and he kind of abandons her to speak with Tessa, his mother, who's so cruel to her. And I'd love to hear you talk a bit about how you wrote Gabriel and how you sort of plotted his growth over time.
Yeah, I think I really understood who Gabriel was because, but probably, over time, because I understood that he, on the surface, was the boy that had everything, who had privilege and entitlement and, these extremely wealthy landowning parents, and his life never gets knocked off course. He wants to go to Oxford, he does go to Oxford, everything works out the way it's meant to for Gabriel. But he also has a lot of insecurity. And I think that he has grown up in a fairly loveless household. His father's very distant and very removed. His mother loves him, but in the wrong way. She just wants too much from him. And she's so snobbish and she doesn't think Beth is good enough for him. And I think I felt that I understood completely why it seems like weakness in Gabriel. Beth is very strong and she's outspoken at the beginning and she tries to stand up to Tessa. And what she cannot understand is why Gabriel doesn't stand up to his mother. Why he doesn't, does he hear the terrible things that she says? Why does he just let them go? And the reason for that is because I know that his mother is one of those sort of she's a drunk and she twists and her husband and son know that and they know that it's eggshells and Gabriel just shuts down. It's almost like a sort of form of trauma in a way. And so I understood all of that about Gabriel. And I think that the really sad thing for him is that with Beth Beth actually is the one who grows up in a very loving, normal household with parents. Her mother's quite modern, her mother gives her contraception, her mother accepts that she's having sex before marriage, all these things. They're modern and they're loving. Um, and Beth is the same. And so she's the first person who shows Gabriel what sort of real warmth and real love can be. And so it's his great loss, of course, that he loses her, I think. Um, and by the end, I mean, I feel he's the one who loses out, because he doesn't end up with Beth. I like to think that he has a lovely girlfriend in California, but I think that he does show huge growth because he's dealt the harshest of all blows, isn't he, to discover that he had a child he never knew. But he makes peace with it, and I think in a very emotionally mature way by meeting Frank and befriending Frank, despite him being the man who slept with, despite him being, in a way, his rival. Yeah, so I think he does show growth, but I also think he's probably the unluckiest.
I love that you bring up Tessa because I think she is a character that I found so interesting in this story. I mean, she may be the closest thing we get to a villain, a true, villain in this story. And yet I couldn't help but think she was also maybe serving as a secret barometer for Beth, showing her that maybe she was in a world that she didn't quite understand the way that she thought she did.
Yeah, I agree with you. I sort of loved writing Tessa, but I did have to work quite hard to bring her back a little bit so that she wasn't too villainous. I mean, she is villainous, but I think I knew quite a lot in my head. I had a lot of backstory for her, and I knew that she, of course, had fallen in love but didn't leave, which you've discovered that in the book, and that's one of the reasons for her behaving so appallingly. But also, I think what it is that she doesn't come from that world, and Beth reminds her of who she was and where she came from, and she doesn't like it and she can't handle it, and so. That's partly the reason, she tries to hide that. She's always trying to be something she isn't. And I think she finds Beth very jarring for exactly that reason.
Yeah, Tessa just, she was so fun to read. She's such an interesting character. Going back to the conversation we were having about grief, in addition to grief, the way that Bobby died really hangs over Beth and Frank's marriage. It seems like they're not really capable of talking about it. And I thought the scene that you wrote, where Frank and Beth go away for her birthday, where Beth sort of thinks that her togetherness with Frank is the reason that they can't heal from Bobby's death. I would love to hear you talk a bit about why that is.
Yeah, I think that basically the problem that they have is that Frank is so guilty, and and Beth probably puts quite a lot of guilt on him because she holds him responsible, even though there are things that she could have done too. Um, and so this sort of guilt is at the heart of their marriage, and it's destroying them. And what is really destroying them is the fact that because Frank is so shut down by his guilt and by the fact that inadvertently Beth's life's destroyed. She's loved the person she lost the person she loves the most, and he can't allow her to grieve, and he can't allow her to remember their son. And this is really what puts their marriage into turmoil. I think had he been able to be more mature and to allow her to remember him and to talk about him and to keep his memory alive, then I don't think she would have gone to Gabriel. I think a lot of the temptation with Gabriel is that she can talk to Gabriel about Bobby. And so I think that there is actually quite something I cut out, because it worked better to end part two after the oak tree and then to move on to part three, which is Jimmy. Um, but I had written another, I don't know, 10 chapters in part two, probably quite depressing looking back on it. There was Bobby's funeral and things like that, but also crucially, she goes to Ireland, and I think I mentioned that very briefly, but there were chapters where she's in Ireland and she realizes that they can only heal when they're apart, because she's always looking at him and he's always waking up feeling guilty. And the thing they always had in their marriage was honesty, and they're sort of not being honest with each other because they don't want to bring each other down. It's a horrible, horrible balancing act. Neither of them really wants to tip the other one over the edge. And so I do believe that they would have healed quicker if they'd had more time apart.
I think too something that's so interesting is how young Beth and Frank were when they met, when they started their relationship, and they've really grown up so together. And they maybe didn't have a chance, it feels, to always understand who they are separately. And when these outside forces come in that force them to analyze who they are, not in this partnership, it really throws both of them, I think.
I think it does, and something that I really like about Frank and Beth and their arc is that I know I didn't dwell on this very much, but in those months when they're waiting for the trial, it's warts and all, and in a way they get a chance to start their relationship again, and they didn't expect it. I think perhaps that Frank thought until everything happens with Jimmy that they would have broken up and she would have gone to Gabriel, and maybe she thought that as well. But instead, what happens is this terrible thing happens. And so she's there to support Frank and she realizes that she loves him, but she needs him to know who she is, how flawed she is. And he needs to start to admit his guilt. And he does. And so, in a way, this shocking incident makes them start their relationship from scratch in a much better, more honest way. So I think they've got what it takes to survive the future.
So glad to hear that. I really liked the way you talked about how they weren't really having full honesty with each other. I thought what was really interesting about the book is the way you wrote the village of Hempston itself. I loved how you described it as this place that clearly deeply cares for its community. You know, the way they pulled this wedding together for Nina and Jimmy. But it also felt like a place that does tend to also sweep difficult things under the rug a bit. You know, Beth makes a comment in early on in the book about how after a week or two, really no one in the village would talk to her about Bobby's death. And I would love to hear you talk a bit about writing the people of this village and if you think it's sort of the way this community is had an impact on their marriage as well, that they were sort of raised in this community where you didn't talk about difficult things.
I think it did. Yeah, I absolutely think it did. I think I love to think of one of the things that survived every single draft was the Compasses pub. Um, and I could always see the village there on a Friday. You've got the policemen, you've got the farmers, everybody is there. And I think that there's a duality to a life like that. In some ways, it's fantastic. Everybody helps everybody else. Frank is leaving food parcels for the people who need them. He's going around and fixing broken doors and bits of machinery. He's lending his fields. And everybody else is doing the same thing. Exactly as you say, in the wedding, it all comes together, and every wedding comes together like that. But there's some real judgment too. I think it's that sort of gossipy goldfish bowl existence where people pass judgment so quickly. I really liked the one very brief scene before the trial, which is sort of written in third person, which is the village voice. And I did once toy with, and I remember my agent really loved it, but in the end, it was all Beth. I had a village voice, and I really enjoyed writing it. And in my head, the village is a character in its own right as well. And I do think that village life can be very tough. It's great when it's going well, and when it's going badly, your business is being discussed in the shop, it's being discussed in the playground. The eyes are watching all the time. And people are making, 2 plus 2 makes 5. They're gossiping and they're deciding your life. So it was the perfect environment for Beth to have a secret affair because how long could that stay secret? Very claustrophobic, I think.
One of the characters that seemed to me that really felt all sides of this sort of duality was Jimmy himself, who spent a lot of time in the pub, who spent a lot of time, with Nina, and yet on the farm as well, and sort of lived in all of these spheres. And I think for me, Jimmy was the character going through that every time something happened, my heart was just like, oof, because you just feel for him. And yet sometimes I know when I was reading, I would be like, I wish I could understand why you're making this choice because you just want him to do something different. You want him to pull it together and to keep that growth that you see. And I know for me, something that was so interesting was Jimmy's particular dislike of Gabriel and his view on that situation because it was so impactful for him. And I would love if you could just talk a little bit about writing Jimmy and the decision that sort of his choices that sort of hinge so much of the ending action on.
Yeah, well, Jimmy was I love Jimmy, and I think he was a character who could have been quite dislikable. And so again, I had to work quite hard on him because I think he probably had quite a few edits actually, because maybe I cut out more violence and more drinking because those are very unappealing qualities. But what I always knew about Jimmy was that he had a huge heart, and I always knew that he had stopped caring about himself, which is a complex reaction to grief. And because he's only 9 when his mother dies, and because his father's completely closed off, and his brother's only 13 and doing his best, but it's not good enough, he his reaction to loss is to think that he's unlovable, and it's to self-sabotage, and that self-sabotage button, self-destruct button, is buried deep in him. And Beth and Frank desperately want him to get back on track, and Nina comes along and she's incredible and he has everything, but that self-destruct, he just can't stop pushing it. And I understand it. But I think, and I hoped he came across as a lovable rogue, and I think I showed him caring with the animals, because it was important to show how caring he is, simply because he's a bit of a car crash as well, unfortunately.
And he did come across so he was just a character you root for, I think, in a way where I didn't expect at the beginning. And in a lot of ways, he almost seemed to me a foil for Gabriel, someone who is given so many moments where you're like, this is it to pull it together, and just that same unlucky can't quite put all the pieces where they need to be.
Yeah, and also I think that scene that comes quite close to the end when he's drunk and Gabriel tells him to get in the car. I really sort of, I really could see that scene from both perspectives. I could see that Gabriel's probably got a slightly posh voice, and he's the grown up in this scenario because he's sober, and Jimmy is vehemently drunk, and I can see that he would hear it as being really patronizing and enraging, and I can see that Gabriel would feel incredibly frustrated and think that he was dealing with a child. So yeah.
You have developed such interesting characters who have a lot of contradictions to them, like Jimmy does. And something that I noticed as I read on in the novel, early on, Beth makes a lot of statements about how happy and content with her life that she is. And obviously that changes with Bobby's death, but even after that, she seems like she's happy with the life she's chosen. But when she and Gabriel begin their affair, she starts thinking about the things that she gave up. Oxford, this imagined future life with him where, they were these artistic intellectuals writing together and studying together. And I guess I'm curious if you think that Beth was truly happy with her lot in life after she and Gabriel split.
Yeah, I think so. I think that Beth is a really strong woman, and I think that she wanted desperately this intellectual life, and she had unusual aspirations for a girl of her time and place, and she wanted it, and her life got knocked off course really just by snobbery and prejudice. And I think that I don't think she was in love with Frank when she first got together with him. I think she liked him enormously and she knew that she had desired him in the past and that he was hugely likable. I think she did fall in love with him, very much so. But more to than anything, I think that Frank introduces her to wildlife and nature, and it becomes integral to who she is as a person. And I think that although Gabriel triggers that slight craving, like craving for nostalgia, craving for who you once were, also craving for the life you used to want. And along he comes. He's a wildly successful author. He's got everything she used to want. But I think deep down, she would always have made the same choice to go back to Frank because I think she realizes that connecting with nature is a lifelong education. And I think that she is adaptable. And I really like that about her. So I don't think it was second best. I think it was a different best.
And I think that that makes so much sense for the characters, and we really see Beth being so strong in her choices. And I was really impressed by her as a character as you read through, because you can't help but think, oh my God, what would I do in these, like, how do you keep moving forward, especially with the amount of blame that seems to be sort of passed around between these characters, and whether it's warranted or not, or self-imposed or not, especially when we see Frank on the witness stand and he really blames himself for Bobby's death. You can see from the way that he communicates that he has taken this on fully. And I wonder how much Beth feels that same blame for either herself or for Frank, and really the way it ripples out into the entire community and the way it drives Frank's behavior in a way that I think shapes the entirety of the story.
I completely think that. I think that to begin with, it seems as if it's Frank's fault and that she blames him. But her huge learning curve is to accept responsibility for Bobby's death. Not only Bobby's death, but also the way it's affected her husband, the way she's blamed her husband. You know, Beth could not have gone on seeing Helen. Beth, I think Beth, the men are reckless. The men are strong and they're reckless and they believe they're invincible. And she knows she always has this nagging doubt, but she sort of allows herself to be swept away by what they believe and the fact they've always got away with it and everything's always been fine. Well, she could have put her foot down. There are many things that Beth could have done that day, and she didn't do them. And I think the biggest realization for Beth is that she's at fault too. That they all are, and that's huge for her to accept it, and it changes her. And not only does she forgive Frank, she has to forgive herself. They both have quite a tough struggle, but they get there.
Okay, so I am going to get into spoilers now. So if anyone hasn't finished the book, I'm about to drop a big one. The first big twist that you write towards the end of the book about Leo was completely gut-wrenching. Both his actions, but also the way Frank decides to cover up that this little boy shot his brother. Can you talk to us about why Frank did what he did? It's such a huge act of sacrifice for the son of this man who has hurt him so deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a huge act of sacrifice, but the point really is that it's like he needs to do it on so many levels. He needs to do it because Leo is a child and he doesn't want Gabriel to go through the prospect of seeing him on the stand, possibly being taken away, possibly going into some, boys' home or whatever it would be. That's There's that, but really he needs to do this act of self-sacrifice because it's the only way in which he can make amends and forgive himself. And that's what he has to do. He has to take the fall because he feels that he's let down Jimmy. And huge, bigger than any of those, is the fact, of course, that he knows that he has had 9 years with Gabriel's son, and he feels he owes him. And that's really why he does what he does. I'm not even sure that in the moment when it happens, he knows all of those things. I think that he's just a good guy and he just wants the child out of it and away from it. And he doesn't want Gabriel to have to face the loss of Leo. But I think really it's the being in prison and the meeting with Leo and Gabriel every week discussing Bobby that helps him to do the only thing that can save him, which is to process his grief and his guilt. So I think he needed to do it, but tough call.
And it is just such a cathartic moment. Like there, everything changes in that, whether for better or worse, depending. It's such a huge hinge point. But I have to ask a bit of a process question because I'm curious, and I think some of our watchers are too, that when you're writing a book where you have these huge reveals that change the entire story, did you know these the entire time you were writing, or did you have moments where something came to you later on?
Oh yeah, I absolutely didn't. I absolutely didn't. I always knew that Jimmy died, and funnily enough, I put a post on my Instagram, and I think it was about 3 years into writing. The book was 4 years, but and I posted I was on a dog walk, how when a huge twist that makes sense of the whole story drops out of the sky. And I remember now that at the very beginning, I thought that Bobby should be Gabriel's son, but then I thought, no way, that's way too difficult. And then, of course, 3 years in, I'm like, but it has to be. It makes sense of absolutely everybody's actions. Bobby is the heart of the whole story. But it was a complete nightmare because my timelines were all out, and yeah, it was very difficult. But and then Leo came late too. Leo, I think before Bobby, but I think originally the gun went off in the tussle as you see it in the court, and I think it just occurred to me that it should be Leo. And that wasn't that easy either because he's 11, can an 11-year-old fire a gun, all these things. He had to be 11 so that because if you're 11, you have to testify in court, back then anyway. Um, so, yeah, lots and lots of sort of machinations once I'd made those decisions. But the story changed. The love triangle was always there from day one. It dropped out of the sky, and there it was. But the story changed hugely over the many, many rewrites. And I think it's quite hard as a writer to know, sometimes the book was so hard that I would stop writing it. And a couple of people advised in the industry to give up. And I couldn't give up, but I did stop. And actually, that period of stopping was really useful. Those breaks helped me understand it was only Beth's story, not the men, because the men had a voice. And I really sort of believe, for me, hundreds of rewrites is the way, unfortunately.
Well, we are so glad that you didn't stop and that you did write the story that you did. We are coming up on time, so we just have a few more questions for you. Um, the ending of this book was so lovely and hopeful with Frank's return to the farm and his reunion with Grace and Beth. I have to ask, is this family going to be okay? Are they going to be okay? Please tell me they're going to be okay.
They are going to be okay. I think they are already okay. I think I think they've both grown so much, and then they've got gorgeous grace. And it's a new start. They're going to be great. Maybe there's even, I don't think there's another baby, but there might be. But basically, they're going to be good, and they've got her parents there, her loving parents. It's a new life, and it's going to work out.
And they
That
found the cheese recipe.
Yes, they did. There's actually a cheese here. It's called Godminster Cheddar, and I don't know when it started, but maybe like 15 years ago. It's a local cheese, and it's in a red wax, and it's sharp and it's salty, and it definitely inspired me.
Claire, I ask every author we do a book club with the same final question. So I'm going to ask this to you. Is there anything that you want readers to know about this book that we didn't ask, or is there anything that you hope they take away from reading your book?
Oh, well, I hope that they enjoy the journey, of course. I guess I hope that they find it emotionally true because, Beth's story was a tough story to write, and she's a grieving mother, and I really wanted to get that right. And I hope that they would find the ending hopeful, which I do, but I think it's bittersweet because of all the sadness and tragedy that's gone before. And then what something that uh, I really found through spending time with the farmers was that I was guilty of living in these very, very beautiful surroundings without necessarily noticing them. I'd go on the dog walk, but I wasn't really taking it all in. And ever since I spent time with the farmers, I've really connected more to my own surroundings. So I guess that would be nice if readers felt the same reading the book, that they noticed the landscape.
I think it's impossible for them not to. Claire, thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a wonderful conversation. It was such a treat to speak with you. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Come back and see us next month when we discuss our April book club pick, Rabbit Moon. And have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you again, Claire.
Thanks for having me. I've loved it.
Bye, everyone.